Hello YouTube, it's me, I'm back. Hello to anyone that's new to this channel. We're discussing geometry. These are a series of off-the-cuff videos, not rehearsed or scripted in any way, as you can tell. I do apologise for my profanity in the last video, so excuse me for that. So I'm gonna grill away at you guys. I had 2 likes yesterday, so thanks for that. All I want is for some people to start getting it, and and I want some engagement. So I'm going to keep battling away here in the here in the lost echo chambers of YouTube. Hopefully somebody one day will find me. But so until then, it's just me and you guys. But someone please comment. I would love some engagement. The first 3 proportions in geometry. If you want to go back several videos, I've done some AI videos. In those AI videos, excuse me that it is AI, right? But what I've done, I've basically, the language is very precise, and so I've snipped it down without me waffling on about the subject, right? So if you want, I know it's AI, it's a bit boring AI, but so I have put down some videos to do with geometry, and it's basically a creation myth. It's a geometry creation myth. We're talking about a cosmology created with geometry. It's a study of sacred geometry and just I don't particularly like the word sacred geometry, but that's what a lot of people call it, so we'll go with that. We're talking about a thing that I've mentioned before. It's called the canon of proportions, or canon of proportion. So we're going to talk about the first 3 proportions. The first one, the proportions have corresponding shapes. There's another term, it's called the canon of number. We're discussing the duodecimal system, the numbers 1 to 12, and their relationship to geometry. One term for that is a canon of proportions. It's lost favour, this. There've been periods where, it's been really fashionable. The 60s was one, but it was really fashionable in the 19th century. For a time, it was really popular in the Renaissance. It basically was the Renaissance, right? A lot of the geometrical information we're talking about was part of the Renaissance days. This knowledge, which was in old books, right? So basically, when books went into print, this knowledge became fashionable, and since then it's gone into decline, become fashionable again. Maybe it will become fashionable again. Well, I would say actually it is quite fashionable again, but it's lots of people discuss it and come at it from different angles. But what I will say is, though, that it has developed into modern sciences. We're going back to basics. We're talking about a cosmology in geometry, the first 3 proportions. So the circle, drawing a circle, not drawing a circle, but the circle, a number that represents the circle is number 1. And the first proportion is the circle's width, which is, if you measure the distance between but the width of a circle, we're calling that measurement 1, the unit of 1. So the relationship between a circle's width and its circumference is the ratio proportion of pi, right? So that's the first important proportion in geometry. The circle represents the first shape you can make in geometry, but it's the most perfect shape as well. And the number that one of the numbers that corresponds to the circle, and it did in the ancient world, was 1. It's whole, it's perfect. It's, you know, in our creation myth, it is the creation. It's everything within that circle is the creation. It's the first step in geometry. So the first proportion, pi. The second proportion in geometry, in our creation myth, is the square root 2 ratio. The square root 2 ratio, and the square root 2 ratio is represented by a square or a cube, but in a two-dimensional plane, it's represented by a square. The square root 2 ratio is if you draw a square, and then the side or length of that square is the measurement of 1 unit. So if you draw a diagonal line from point to point of that square, and if you imagine swinging that diagonal line down horizontally 90 degrees, that length of that diagonal, you can create a rectangle from that square. So that rectangle is the square root 2 proportion. The square root 2 proportions created with the square. The number that square represents is 4 in geometry. So just to take it back a bit now, we're not taking it back. So the square root 3 relation, the square root 3 ratio is the third proportion. So we've got these are the first 3 proportions, right? Pi, square root 2, then the square root 3 proportion. And the square root 3 proportion is expressed in the Vesica Pisces. If you imagine the width of the Vesica Pisces is the unit 1, which is represented here on the triangle, but that's right hand side of the equilateral triangle in this picture is half of the length is 1, but that length is the same as the width of the Vesica Pisces, the fish shape. The fish shape makes a rhombus inside the Vesica Pisces. That's 2 equilateral triangles. Anyway, I digress. Square root 3 ratio is expressed in the Vesica Pisces and in the equilateral triangle. It's our third most important, or it's our third proportion ratio in our creation story that we're discussing in these videos. So the width of the rhombus or fish shape in the Vesica Pisces, if the unit is 1, the length from top to bottom, represented by the red line, the length of the fish shape is the square root 3 ratio. And that you could make a rectangle, that length, corresponding to the width and the length, and that would be your square root 3 rectangle. I digress. So let's move on. The equilateral triangle is one of the main points of our discussions at the moment. It has 3 inner angles, 60 degrees, right? That make up 180 degrees. In the ancient world, Plato said this. The same goes for the triangle and the tetrahedral. The tetrahedral is made out of 4 equilateral triangles. Plato gave it the element of fire. Now, you might have noticed, there is a 666 represented. 666 numerology is represented in the equilateral triangle. And in ancient esoteric languages or symbology, in our numerical cosmology, 666 has lots of correspondences to do with the sun. It's a solar number, but that just make a mental note of that. I'm not getting mystical. This is but this will become apparent. This will become apparent further down the line in our study. This is tetrahedral geometry. I'll tell you something interesting. The crystalline structure of diamond is the same geometry as this. So the geometry contained within the equilateral triangle. I don't think this is isometric, but one of the terms we're covering is isometric geometry. I don't want to get too bogged down with Freemasonry. I'm a stonemason and a bricklayer. So, a classic representation of the Freemasonic symbol square and compass has geometrical, information in it. Obviously, in Freemasonic lodges, there's, the folklore of Masons going back to, the Jewish temple builders. So, it's no surprise that Jewish mysticism comes into the subject. And the symbology of the lodge is the symbology of the temple. And the symbology of the temple, the measurements of the temple, all correspond to these proportions, and ratios in geometry. So look, we will be discussing the Freemasons, but we're not going to get bogged down with it. But there is an interesting study to do with classic, compass and square. We're talking about our tools in being able to describe our cosmology is basically a compass. You don't need a square. You can do what we're discussing with just a straight ruler. So the compass is necessary in our study. The square is not. But, the relationships in the square root ratios and, are an important part of our study. So, the square symbol is a relevant symbol in our study. The compass speaks for itself. I've covered this already, so, you can pause this and contemplate what we're discussing. I'm going to move on for the sake of the video now. I've got a few pictures lined up. Right, I'm just going to, I'm on repeat here now, right? So, the first three ratios we've discussed and discovered, right? The first ratio is made with the compass making the circle, and that that ratio is pi. The relationship between 1 and pi. That's expressed in just one circle, right? But when in your development of geometry, it's natural to make another circle. So when you combine two circles, you create a Vesica Pisces. It's a natural development in geometry. Children do it naturally. Anyone playing with a compass, will stumble upon this. So, the square root ratio is contained within the shape of the two discs or circles. Merging creates the well-known symbol or shape that some people call Vesica Pisces. It's got loads of names. Vessel of the fish, Piscean vessel, Piscean womb, lots of different names. Commonly because it makes a fish shape. That fish shape is a type of lens. It creates the first proper polygon within the Vesica Pisces. You can create a rhombus. Rhombus is a four-sided shape, but a rhombus is two equilateral triangles back to back. So for the sake of our discussion in the creation myth, as we're progressing through our journey. The marriage, if you like, let's use the term marriage, combining merging of the two circles creates a rhombus. That's our creation in geometry. It's two equilateral triangles together. I know I'm repeating myself, but I'm trying to make a point. And so, but anyway, the first three ratios. Now let me cover this when we move on to the next picture. Pi, which we discuss, the square root 2 ratio, which is, a cube. If you take the width of a cube, that's the measure of 1. The diagonal line of a cube is the square root 2 ratio. So the width of the fish shape here, the unit of 1, and in relationship to its length of the fish shape is the square root 3 ratio. So these are the first three ratios that are important to us. You'll notice, I'll just mention it now, the square root 5 ratio is here. It's a derivative of the golden section. That's pentagonal. That's when we get onto pentagonal geometry, we'll discuss that more. It's very important to our research, the pentagonal geometry, but for the sake of this video, we're going to stick to the first three ratios. So let's move on. I've covered that. Again here, we've had this picture. So our first three square root ratios. I covered this in my last video. Here's a good picture to represent what square root ratios are. Because I covered this in my last video, I'm not going to cover it again. But square root ratios, you can develop different size rectangles as well. So the proportions in these rectangles are important to architects, and they always have been important to architects, and they're important to our study and to the development of geometry as well. These proportions, we're talking about a canon of proportion, and mainly we're going to focus on the first 12, although the proportions go on and on. These ratios are irrational numbers, so thinking about the proportions can go on forever, right? But we're talking about the first basic proportions, right? And their corresponding shapes as well. The square root 1 ratio with the unit 1 corresponds to our circle, the first shape. Square root 2 ratio corresponds to the square. But anyway, I digress. I've lost my track of thought now because I wasn't prepared to say that in this video. But let's move on because I don't want to digress too much. So we're just going to discuss the tetratus and the isometric geometry within the tetratus. This equilateral triangle is what's created in the Vesica Pisces. But you can, so you'll notice here the rhombuses inside, the equilateral triangle. The equilateral triangle is pivotal to the development and understanding of basic plane geometry, and then its, relationship and development into Euclidean geometry, three-dimensional geometry. It's an interesting point to make. The Vesica Pisces is a lens. Let's move on. Here's a Hebrew representation of the tetratus. The Greeks called this the tetratus. The Hebrews had their own, way of describing it. So let's move on. I've covered that. Freemasonic symbol, again, that speaks for itself. Right, so I want to cover this again. I've covered this in my AI videos. In the beginning, this is an important point to remember for future videos, right? And for anyone who's in the study of geometry. When you're developing a knowledge of geometry, the point of origin is where the compass meets the paper and you create a dot. So the first thing you do in geometry is create the center pole. that pole is the center of the universe or creation, cosmology. It's the universal pole, and it's significant, right? It's symbolic as a pole, if you imagine a universal pole, or the pole of the world, right? It's got no dimensions. Everything revolves around that center, right? So in the beginning, the Genesis sort of way of looking at this. Genesis does have geometrical allegories in it. The number 6 isn't, well, all the numbers are important. In our study 1 to 12, so if you consider, the first 12 numbers, Genesis creates the earth in 6 days. And 6 is a very important picture in geometry. So is 7, but God rested on the 7th day, right? So I don't want to get too biblical, but 7 in the Bible, there are 7 spirits of God, 7 candlesticks, 7 gates on a city and stuff like that. And that's all relevant to our discussion. 7, though, what I will say is 7 has got a feminine correspondence in the, its relationship to number. I don't want to get too into the sexual aspects of number, but that there is a way of looking at that as in negative and positive, right? Numbers are negative and positive, right? So anyway, I digress. The second thing you can do what you do in geometry is, from the point you make a circle. So this is the first shape in geometry, the circle, and that's why it's important, in our discussion. It's the first ratio that you can make. The unit of that circle is 1, which represents everything. So the first circle you make in geometry, 1, is everything, right? Everything is contained with that. It's the perfect shape. It represents the sphere, and that's why a circle represents, number 1. So anyway, I digress a bit, but it's important in our discussions to do with geometry. Now, the second thing in our discussion is, and it involves the development of the second ratio, is bringing order, right, to that circle. And that is done by creating 2 axes, and axis is plural for an axis, right? So ax, as in AX, EX, axes. That's plural for AX, AXIS, axis, right? So if you create 2 axes, and create a square, right, in that circle. Let me move on. I think I've got the next picture. Right, so here's the 2 axes. So by doing that, right, we're introducing the second ratio, and that is of, let me move to the next picture. Here it is. You can, by drawing the axes evenly, and splitting the circle into 4 segments, you can create a square. So that square has a relationship to the circle, right? Its points intersect at the circumference of that circle. They have a mathematical, a relationship, a ratio between them, relationships or proportions, right? So we're talking about the proportions and the developments and the significance of the first shapes. The second proportion, the square root 2 proportion, is what you create in geometry, in the creation myth of geometry. I don't want to get too bogged down with that at the moment. I'm just going over it again because I've covered this in some of my videos. I do urge you to watch some of the first videos recently I've made about geometry. I've covered it there in precise detail, right, without me waffling. So our geometry journey moves on, the third ratio you can introduce to that is the triangle, right? But if you introduce two triangles, which are, and the reason you're introducing two triangles is from the Vesica Pisces, in the union or marriage, if you like, in two Vesica Pisces, you have two equilateral triangles. So that's why there are two equilateral triangles in our cosmology. Those two, and it's important because those two equilateral triangles, when you slide them over each other, inside those two equilateral triangles, you create a hexagon, right? Now that hexagon creates a hexagram, right? So the hexagram with the points that meets the edges of the square, is your Star of David, the six-pointed star, right? So the proportions and the relationships between the shapes, now what they're making is an inner circle with an outer ring, with a ring in the dark, and then there's an outer ring. There are three rings here, right? But the Star of David makes a circle. If you make a circle in the center, the proportions and the relationships between these shapes all correspond to each other, and they're important as well because they tie into the first three proportions that we're discussing, right? And they're significant because of this diagram that we're making. This is our creation myth. It's been done before, right? Geometers were doing this hundreds of years ago, and these shapes are important in the study of geometry. That some of the ancient temples have this geometry encoded into them. I'm not making this up. We're going to get onto that. So so we're going to move on for the sake of the argument today. But we'll come back to this because I'm going to keep grilling away. Remember this for future reference as well. The area of these circles in the two-dimensional is part of our study as well, right? So, and there are numbers that we're going to develop from, our unit 1 and its relationship, to the circle. That's our measure, right? Our first unit of 1. We're developing a number system, and we're developing the shapes that correspond to those numbers and their meaning in geometry. So this is all, it's universal knowledge about geometry, this, and their proportions. So, and that's what we're talking about, a canon of proportion, the canon of number. We're going to move on for today, though. The rhombus, the two equilateral triangles back to back created in the Vesica Pisces, the square root 3 ratio. It's going to be, hopefully, here the first three. Oh, I hit the pause button and missed it then. Sorry for stumbling. So our first three shapes that correspond to our first three ratio is, I'm sorry this is blurred, guys, right? But first proportion is 1 and its relationship to the circumference of a circle. So our first ratio proportion is pi. The second ratio proportion that we're in our study is related in its relationship to a square. Sorry, I digress. So our second ratio is the square root 2 ratio, and that corresponds to the square. And our third ratio proportion corresponds to the rhombus, which is two equilateral triangles. I'm sorry, that's a really bad picture. So that's what I wanted to cover today. I'll say something about this as well. I did cover this in our creation myth. We have a world pole. That world pole is represented by the compass, right? It's the universal pole, and the creator, the great architect for this, what I don't. This is, look. This is just the literature, right? Our geometer, our creator, who in our creation myth that we're discussing, the symbolism is that he swung his compass and made a circle, and that whole circle was his creation, right? That's the sort of metaphorical explanation. We'll move on. So you create a circle. What comes after a circle? And this will explain number 2 to you, right? Well, not completely though, yeah, but I will discuss number 2. What is number 2? If one is everything, right? Well, 2 is either, the symbolism of 2 is either splitting that 1 in half, right? Or, having 1 and 2. And then if you combine those, combining 1 and 2 makes the 3. This is all symbolic, right? I'm sorry if that doesn't make sense. I don't want to sound too mystical. But going back to the vesicle Pisces, when you combine 2 circles, you create the first shape in geometry. The first shape that isn't a circle, right? That's got meaning to it, and that is the fish vessel, the womb, whatever you want to call it, Piscean vessel, creates this rhombus, which is 2 equilateral triangles. We're talking about a marriage of 2 circles, but the marriage of those 2 equilateral triangles makes the hexagon. My point is that the 2 equilateral triangles are important in the development story, right? And I'm going to keep grilling away at that. It's fascinating that there's 2 equilateral triangles made. You combine them together, you get the hexagon. Isometric, we're talking about isometric geometry. I think that's the correct term. So yeah, the two triangles, if you had them point to point and then, let them slide over each other, you will develop the hexagon in the middle of the 2 equilateral triangles. And that's the symbol of the Star of David, right? We're talking about the geometry, so let's not get too mystical. The union of 2 circles, Vesica Pisces. I don't want to let this video go on too long now, so I'm going to let it wrap up. I basically made a couple of mistakes yesterday in my discussions with you, because I'm doing this all unrehearsed, just off the cuff. Excuse me. Let's leave it on this picture. This is a picture of, I think it's Pythagoras, or is it Socrates? Or is it Plato? Excuse me. It's one of them, but that doesn't really matter. In the ancient Greek mystery schools, this subject was rediscovered, if you like. The ancient knowledge really came from, the Greeks learned it from Sumeria and Egypt, didn't they? This picture says 1,000 words though. Above the head of the figure, between the 2 pillars, you've got the tetratus, which is equilateral triangle, with the 10 dots in. We discussed that the Hebrew equivalent was the Hebrew tree of life, with its 10 points of the 10 points on the Kabbalah, the tree of life. The Greek's version of that was the tetratus. If you look at the bottom left of this diagram, you've got the tree of knowledge. Above it you have a harp. This does, we will get onto the musical relationships with the 12 tones in the octave, but the 12 tones in the octave is related to our subject. The 8 and the 7 the 7 of the octave, the 8 of like completing the full circle of an octave, but then the 12 tones as well. If you add all the tones in the octave, you've got 12 notes, 12 tones, notes that make the octave. Yeah. Anyway, we'll get onto that. That's like a bit above our pay grade for now. 3-4-5 triangle. Dog sneezing. We'll get onto that. That's prominent. You notice between the two pillars you've got the stairway going up. The symbology there to do with 11. Well, actually, no. More with 7, 11. 7, 9 and 11 actually. We'll get on to 7, 9 and 11. 7, 9 and 11. They're all, you know, they got the correspondences. And they're in our canon of proportion. But we'll get onto that. We don't want to go too far ahead of ourselves. The man figure here is holding, I think it's Socrates, isn't it? Or Plato. He's holding the tetratus. He's holding the tetrahedral. The tetrahedral is made out of 4 equilateral triangles. And it's going to be very important in our studies going down the line. So, yeah, the Greeks' name for, you know, that triangle that's above his head is a tetratus. The Hebrew's name for it, in the Hebrew, you know, we're talking about 2 different branches of the same study, similar study, but both from the same roots, right? Is the tree of life. If you look at the old tree of life, so it's got 3, on the stand it's got 3 branches, and then it's got the main stem, and then it's got the 7 branches above. On the Jewish tree of life, that will become that will become part of our discussion as well. I've already covered it a bit, but we'll move on to that and its relationship. So key point here is, you know, if you want to go off and have a look at stuff, go off and look at, you know, tetratus, the Greek tetratus, and Hebrew tree of life, or you know, the Kabbalah, whatever. I'm not telling you to do anything, do what you want, but we'll leave it here for this video. I've covered what I wanted to cover, and I'll see you on the other side. Talk to you soon. Have a powerful one. Bye for now.